people may or may not join us. It's great to see all these people from Virginia and Tennessee. Thank you thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure the meeting will be much better for that. We're going to be talking about how the climate needs peace. It's absolutely appalling that this issue is never in the main media when it talks about climate change, however savvy they pretend to be about climate change and going net carbon zero and all the rest of it. They never talk about the effect of preparing for war and the effects that war would have on it, as though, you know, we make a big exception so that it doesn't count if the earth goes down the tubes because of a big war. That really, why should we worry about that, for heaven's sake? Anyway, it's great to see you all, as I said. We've got two speakers tonight, and the first is going to be Hilary Evans of the Movement for the Abolition of War. She and Sally are, I saw today, acting secretaries of MORE. Is that right? Still right?
Hilary is the vice chair.
Oh, right. Well, that's not what it said on the screen I saw, really. Good. You're particularly welcome. And Hilary is clearly one of the people who leads on this topic in the Movement for the Abolition of War. So we're very pleased that she's going to talk about that. She's going to talk for, I don't know, 20 to 30 minutes. And then we're going to invite Linda Modica from APEC, Appalachian Peace Education Center, to talk about a similar topic, but she's not going to overlap a lot, if at all, which is brilliant. So perhaps we can invite Hilary to get going.
Right, I will just share the screen if I can. Yeah, that's it, isn't it? Phew. Yeah. Yeah, well, okay, thank you. And thanks for inviting me. And it's very exciting to be at a meeting with all these people from the Appalachians as well. That's really nice. I thought I'd start with COP25 in Madrid, and this is a picture of our Movement for the Abolition of War banner. War causes climate change causes war, and there is the main entrance to COP25. We were standing there totally illegally, and we knew that we'd get moved on, but we just had time for a quick photo before we were moved on by the police. And we then went, now why isn't this, sorry, it's not, never mind, I'll do it this way. No, oh, what have I done? That's it. And we then found a totally legal place to stop by the entrance to the conference centre, which was brilliant because it was right by where people were coming off the metro and the bus stop. They were coming out of buses and taxis and going to and fro into the delegates and visitors and, you know, everybody going to and fro into the conference centre. So everybody, thousands and thousands of people passed us and saw our message as we stood there, and lots of them stopped to talk, and lots of them were very supportive, or they asked questions. And so it was really good, a really good thing to do, I think. And lots of people took photographs. So there are hundreds of photos of this banner circulating around the world somewhere. It must be quite a well-known banner, I think. It was I actually had quite an adventure getting there, because David, who's at the other end of the banner, who I thought was going to join us tonight, and perhaps he will, but he's a bit late, I don't know, my colleague in MORE, he was very organised and he booked a train ticket well in advance, but my decision to go was very much at the last minute, and I went, and by that time all the reasonably priced train tickets had been sold. So I went by coach, and it was a 28-hour journey. I think it was about 28 hours. And I sort of set off with some trepidation, wondering if I'd actually survive the journey. But actually it was really quite an adventure, quite good fun, very enjoyable, very interesting. And so I was, you know, really glad that I'd been. So this is our message. We gave out leaflets as well, explanatory leaflets to passers-by. So what is our message? Well, it should really be shown as a vicious circle, because each of these feeds into the other. War causes climate change, and that, you know, climate change causes war. And it should also be a bit more nuanced, I suppose, as well. It is a bit more nuanced. Somebody said to me only a few weeks ago, you don't really think that war would end if the climate crisis was solved, do you? So, you know, he was taking it really very literally, what it says on this banner, but it's really more about contributory factors, I suppose. So let's have a look at the, why aren't my slides changing? Anyway, they're changing with the mouse, but they're not changing with the button. So let's have a look at the second of those statements. Climate change contributes to war, because that statement or that idea is very much very well known, already very well known and widely accepted. All the major charities have been saying this for a long time. Policymakers have been recognising this for a long time. Even leading military figures have been recognise it as well, that climate change with the droughts and the floods leads to soil degradation, and that leads to food shortages and competition for scarce resources, which leads to mass migration, and that can so often increase political instability, which multiplies the threat of war. And of course, you know, the mass migration is barely starting, and yet we've seen some sort of pretty ugly reactions to it in this country anyway, already. So goodness knows quite where that's going to stop. But what is almost never mentioned is the other half of that vicious circle, that war contributes to climate change. War itself contributes to climate change, and very, very rarely do you hear, I mean, we're hearing politicians talking about COP26 and emissions, cutting this, cutting that, but we never hear anything about these military related emissions. And Scientists for Global Responsibility have done a lot of work on this, and they estimate that about 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions result from military-related activity. It's very difficult, of course, to arrive at an estimate, because exact figures are often cloaked in secrecy and difficult to obtain. SGR uses data from academic research, government sources and corporate reports in reaching its conclusions. And this 6% figure encompasses the whole process of war from beginning to end, including the things listed here: extraction of raw materials and the manufacture of equipment and weaponry. And if you just sort of stop to think of each of those things, really, and then you think about the amount of equipment and weaponry that's in circulation throughout the world, you know, it does give you an idea of how these figures mount up. Trials and training with massive fuel use, maintenance of vast numbers of bases and buildings worldwide, use of fuels and explosive in warfare. So then we come on to the actual warfare, and resulting fires. Now, fires can be very devastating. Fires can be accidental, of course, but they can also be deliberate, as in the case of the 19 91, I think it was, Gulf War, when I read an estimate that about 2% of global emissions that year were resulted from the fires of the oil wells that have been deliberately started that year. Extend, and this is the next one is one that's can so easily be forgotten. The extensive rebuilding of devastated infrastructure, because that is so reliant on carbon hungry cement and steel. And when you think of these pictures that we see on our television screens of the sort that's at the bottom right there, with the you know, loads of devastated buildings that all have to be rebuilt afterwards. And of course, I mean, let's not forget, you know, that of course, war, this sort of thing, is a humanitarian catastrophe. We know that, but the point that I'm making here is not to minimize that in any way, but just to say that we must remember that it's an environmental catastrophe as well. And these three little add-ons along the bottom, destroyed vegetation. Of course, once vegetation is destroyed, that's giving up carbon. Delivery of humanitarian aid apparently has quite a large carbon footprint because of the transportation, and things like portable generators aren't the most efficient necessarily. And weak governance. When countries are consumed by conflict, often the governance is weak, and it tends to mean that they're less likely to participate in global efforts to cut emissions. So that has an effect as well. So you can see what a mixed bunch of emission sources are here, and therefore how complicated it would be to calculate totals, even if the will was there. Companies, some mining companies, for example, arms manufacturers, might declare some or all of their emissions. Many companies these days have corporate social responsibility reports, and they often provide some environmental information as part of those. But there are huge disparities between companies in what they report, so they're not very reliable at all. In this country, the Ministry of Defence does actually publish some of its emissions figures, but they tend to be mostly to do with estates. So concerning the military bases and the civilian buildings, and they will tell you, yes, they're cutting back on their emissions because they've put some more solar panels on the roofs, or they've introduced electric cars onto the bases, or things like that. The MOD is much more secretive about its operational emissions when it's actually war fighting. Now, I'm giving a general overview of the situation, but if you want facts and figures, this is where to look. Stuart Parkinson, the Director of Scientists for Global Responsibility, has done a lot of really careful work, and you'll find lots of interesting graphs if you look at these reports and the presentation on the right-hand side that he's done. Well worth looking at. You'll find a graph in which estimates that the UK military probably produces about 11 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent a year, but declares only about 0.9 million tonnes, for example. And at the bottom there, the Conflict and Environment Observatory, they've done a lot of good work as well, and two particular blogs might be of interest: the military's contribution to climate change and how does war contribute to climate change. So all, you know, all interesting stuff here if you want to follow this up further. For a US perspective, there's an academic called Nita Crawford who's done a lot of work for the Costs of War project at, I think it's Brown University, but perhaps our Appalachian friends know more about that than I do. Yeah, so More has been, Movement for the Abolition of War has been trying for several years to draw attention to this link between military activity and the climate. And now, since March 2021, or at least that's the date of the report, the Ministry of Defence has come out and agreed with us, has recognised that vicious circle that I was talking about. Look what it says in their report of, I have to just turn people off so I can read the quotation. This is what it says in their report of March 2021. The threats of our modern world, made worse by rising seas, extreme weather conditions and creeping desertification, will almost certainly lead to more conflict. More conflict in itself will damage the planet, therefore making it far less likely that we will reach any of the climate change Paris goals. So there we are, we're in agreement with the Ministry of Defence. What's the problem? Good news, surely. Well, the problem is that, as has already been mentioned, that these emissions don't have to be declared, and so they aren't taken into account when reduction targets are set. And of course, anything to do with the military and security tends to be sacrosanct. It tends to be beyond questioning or beyond criticism. So nobody ever dares really raise it. And the failure to declare it started at Kyoto at the Kyoto conference in 1997, when the US military demanded exemption from reporting military emissions on national security grounds, and other countries seem to just jump on the bandwagon. And then at the Paris conference in 2015, it was agreed that countries would no longer automatically have the right to exclude these emissions from their national reduction targets, but they wouldn't be obliged to cut them either, to disclose them or cut them either. So it seemed to be pretty much like business as usual, really. In other words, disclosure is still voluntary, and who's going to disclose it when they don't have to? But as Stephen Kretzmann says, the atmosphere certainly counts the carbon from the military, therefore we must as well. There's no reason for ignoring it in this way. And just another little quotation from Ban Ki-moon, former UN Secretary General. The environment has long been a silent casualty of war and armed conflict. The environmental consequences of war are often widespread and devastating. And this is what Mark Carney said, not in connection with military emissions, but speaking of greenhouse gas emissions generally. What gets measured gets managed. And of course, the real goal, counting these emissions is only the first hurdle. The purpose of counting is so that we know what has to be managed and reduced. This is a two-part campaign, first to get them counted, but the ultimate goal, of course, is to reduce these emissions. And how can that be achieved? Well, this is the Ministry of Defence's plan in but how to achieve that, how to reduce the emissions. And the Ministry of Defence does take the climate crisis very seriously. If you read its recent report, you will, accept that they are very concerned about, and the government is in its integrated review as well, that was produced that came out, published at the same time in March earlier this year. So what the Ministry of Defence is saying is that its solution is to adapt its current system to reduce emissions by finding low carbon alternatives and extending its use of renewable energy. So, for example, it's planning to use biofuels and other synthetic fuels for warplanes. Low carbon manufacturing methods within its supply chains. These are some of the things that it mentions as ways of reducing its military related emissions. More solar panels on military buildings, more electric vehicles at bases, offsetting, for example, by planting trees on military land, increased use of drones, cleaner and more efficient technology, and nuclear powered vessels. Well, of course, all of these, I think we all recognise, have weaknesses. None of them seems exactly ideal. If you concentrate on biofuels, you're then in competition with food, with land for food. Offsetting, unreliable. It's often a bit of a cop-out. Drones, we know something about the problems with drone warfare. Nuclear powered vessels, lots of problems, including disposal of waste. So not exactly ideal, I would think, their plan, but an alternative opportunity. Now, Christiana Figueres and others have been urging us for some time to regard COP26 as an opportunity to take stock, to find ways of doing things differently, more sustainably, to improve all areas of life. And of course, the pandemic and the climate problems that have been showing themselves in the last few years have shown, these existential threats have shown that real security has much more to do with human and planetary well-being and international cooperation than with military might, belligerence, and the protection of narrow national borders. And of course, the first duty of government, they will always tell us, is to keep citizens secure. We all want security, but what makes us feel secure? And I'm not sure that, you know, that plan, it certainly doesn't make me feel secure. The Ministry of Defence's plans for cutting their emissions. The UN definition of human security, or a UN definition, is freedom from fear, including protection from violence and environmental crises, freedom from want, including provision of decent food, healthcare and housing, freedom from indignity, including from human rights abuses.
She's been sleeping all day.
So these are alternatives. This is another way of thinking about reducing our emissions. And for more about these notions of security, you might like to look at the link here. Rethinking Security produced a response to the government's integrated review this year, and it's well worth looking at, I think, if you want to see some a good good description of what we might want when we want to feel secure. So instead of military solutions as put forward by the MOD, why not try some of these? Now, I know I'm speaking to the converted here, of course. But why not try questioning the deeply embedded cultural assumptions about the acceptability, effectiveness and inevitability of armed conflict as a way of resolving disputes. We in Movement for the Abolition of War are particularly keen to sort of highlight these cultural norms that are so prevalent in society, that war is inevitable. And I think if you go into a classroom of children and say, do you think war is a good thing? They'll all say, no, of course it isn't. And I'm sure if you stopped 100 people in the street and said, do you think war is a good thing? Unless they're arms dealers or something, they would all say, no, of course it isn't. But you say to the same group of, say, children, well, why do we have so many wars? Why is there so much war? And they say, well, that's the way it is. It's human nature, or it's always been like that, or there's nothing we can do about it. This idea of it being acceptable, an acceptable way of resolving our conflicts, or an inevitable way of resolving our conflict, I think has to be questioned all the time. And I don't think it is either acceptable or inevitable. Other things we should be pushing for: controlling the arms trade, diverting some of the trillions of dollars of global military spending into climate transition needs, and addressing honestly the underlying causes of conflict, making better use of more civilized ways of resolving it than by military means through the channels that are already available. The United Nations, and here's I've put forward a plug for the poor old United Nations that gets so much of a bad press, really. People sort of ignore its achievements and focus on its weaknesses, and certainly it does need improving, but again, there's so much sort of general ignorance of the United Nations amongst children in school, amongst the general population. We should be supporting, I think, and promoting the ideals of the UN. And just on to the last one. This is just a few funding facts. On the left here, we've got a graph produced by Stuart Parkinson, which compares military and climate spending. And I think he says that it's actually the spending on reducing carbon emissions, he says is estimated because there are no official figures, but you can see that the spending, UK government, this is UK government spending 2021 on the military is over £40 billion, whereas the spending on reducing climate emissions is looks about £3 billion, isn't it? So just a fraction, really. And yet, related to that, on the right-hand side here in this blue box, Ministry of Defence policymakers are constantly, constantly assessing perceived security risks, and they work on the principle that even a 1% risk is unacceptable, and therefore it attracts extra military funding. So if they think that the level of risk has risen by even just 1%, then that attracts that we get more tanks, more bombs, more aircraft. And yet, think about the certainty of 100% climate risk in the near future, and that receives only this paltry funding. And that little nugget was found by David, who was at the other end of the banner, who may or may not be here tonight, and reported by the Oxford Research Group. And just at the bottom right there, just a little look at this. There's been some talk on the news today about international climate finance. But I just wanted this is from a government website, showing what good value for money we get from investing in this international climate finance. This was something we agreed to in the Paris in 2015, and this is the idea is that rich countries support developing countries in responding to the developing countries who have difficulty in responding to the challenges of climate change. And investing climate finance today, says the government, investing climate finance today helps reduce costs tomorrow. Every £1 invested well in climate-related risk reduction saves more than £3 and possibly as much as £50 in avoided disaster impacts. Similarly, every pound spent cutting CO2 pays for itself between 5 and 20-fold by offsetting the future costs of climate change. So this international climate finance is judged by our own government to be very good value for money. And that's the end of what I wanted to say, except what we are saying then is that it's time to demand that COP26 sets limits with no exceptions for military related emissions, and no reliance on offsetting schemes, and a requirement for independent verification. And there is a petition that Abingdon Peace Group can sign, which calls for this, which I sent details to you, Sally, or you've probably seen them anyway, and Mike, I think. The the Climate and Environment Observatory have set this up, and there's also one from Well Beyond War. They've also got a petition for the calling for the same thing, that these military emissions must be recognised and counted, taken into account. Okay, I think that's all I want to say.
Oh, thank you so much, Hilary. That was your talk was so full of useful information, and your slides are an absolute mine of info that we can refer to embed our understanding of what you've been talking about. So thank you very much. I'm wondering if we could take a few questions now for Hilary, and then move on to Linda. Then afterwards we could have more questions, of course, and a short general discussion as well. Would that be acceptable? Any questions? You'll need to unmute yourself if you wish to ask a question or make a point. Annette, you need to unmute. Go ahead, Annette, but you need to unmute.
Right.
There we are.
If you had asked me beforehand, I would have.
Not here.
Sorry,
We can't hear you, Annette.
You can't hear me at all.
very faint.
Sorry, you can't hear me at all.
It's better now, but not very strong.
Better now?
No.
Yeah, that was.
No.
Yeah.
All I wanted to say is, I think 6% is low. If you had asked me, I might have opted for 15%. Okay?
Yeah, well, I remember in 2015, I wrote a sort of short piece about this, and I'd read a couple of people estimating 10%. And I asked Stuart Parkinson, of Scientists for Global Responsibility, what he thought about these figures. I asked Stuart Parkinson what he thought about these figures, whether he thought 10% or 6%. I think I'd read 6%, 7% and 10%. And I said, what did he think? And he said, well, he hadn't done as much work on it at that stage, but he would be very reluctant to go above 6 from what he knew at that stage. He said, well, it could be more, but I only have evidence for 6%. Since then, he's done a lot more careful analysis of the figures and done much more careful estimating and so on. And he's now saying, yes, I think my 6% is the closest to what I can get. But you see, these figures are it's so difficult to get the information, and it's so difficult to, estimate. I mean, when you look at those the pictures of devastated buildings on the other side of the world, how do you estimate those? Really, it's very, very difficult to get a proper estimation. But this is what Stuart has come up with, and so you may be right. It may well be higher, but at least it's probably safe to say that it's no less than 6%.
Thank you very much for that. That's an interesting issue that Annetta opened up, and I can see there's a sense in keeping the estimates low and raising them as more work is done. Because the moment you pitch it higher, people who don't want you to be right, whatever you say, will have a stick to beat you with, basically. So that's not a very specific way of putting it, but I'm sure that's right. Well, shall we turn to, oh, sorry, Tony, or Una, I'm not sure whose hand I can see there.
That's my hand, yes. I'm just quoting from an article in last Sunday before last paper, and it's about the subject that we're talking about. And in the opening paragraph, it says that Joe Biden complains that Afghanistan alone costs the US £300 million a day for 20 years. Bearing in mind that, it was a totally fruitless exercise in many ways, and this has been discussed fully. How can you, the great problem is that how can you change people's minds? Is there some sort of way, or can anybody suggest any way that this contrast between money that is sort of frittered away on arms can be diverted to things more productive, like medical research, anything you like, agricultural development? That there doesn't seem, people do not seem to sort of gather that war is totally wasteful. How do we address this problem? Because as the speaker said, people take it in but say, oh, that's the way the world is. How can we change that view? I know it's a difficult, well, an impossible question really, but has anybody any comments to make on this?
I do.
Oh, right. Francis.
Well, I think that one thing we could do is to ask for the military to have to justify their research, because a lot of the things are done under different headings. So a lot of the things are done under, as you say, medical research. So they're actually developing all sorts of things that could be used in a military context. Huge amount of public money goes towards it. A huge lot of military money goes towards it. And yet they're developing things that could absolutely ruin the environment in a heartbeat. And then, what was the other thing? Oh yeah, technology, the drones, all that surveillance technology, it's all under different headings. So it's very difficult to wake people up to the spending because they think it's just brilliantly bringing, you know, faster internet and opportunities. People don't realize how it's supporting the war and the, you know, the whole machinery of war and damage of the environment. They're not even checking. So one thing could be that that we can ask, because of this 6%, you know, just make a statement or start making some little articles that say, well, maybe if they are contributing such a high amount to anyway, if they are contributing such a high amount to global warming, then each thing needs to be, just each bit of research, each manufacturing thing needs to be given an environmental impact statement and passed by a committee or something like that, so that we're not just giving them carte blanche to just, you know, do whatever they want to do and trash the place at the same time, because for our security, you know, which is dubious, as we know.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I would love to share from across the ocean some frustration with you all. Imagine how we peacemakers felt when we heard that the only way that our governor in Tennessee could think of saluting the healthcare workers during this crisis that we're experiencing, health crisis that we're experiencing, was to have an overflight burning jet fuel wastefully, you know. Wow. And this type of thing happens at car races, at state fairs. The military is called out, our National Guard or the Air Force, whatever base is closest, to come out and waste the climate. It's impossible to understand, and so we share your frustration in Britain, and I'm at a loss except for calling and screaming at them, saying, "What the hell are you doing, and why are you doing this?" That's and I did, but like most of us, maybe some of you great environmentalists on this call did call and say, "What the hell? You know, why are you doing this?" But I didn't. I know I didn't. But I'm still frustrated, and I think I'll make myself a list to do to make sure that this is one thing that gets eliminated from military practices in the United States. These overflights, I forget what they're called, the angels, flying angels or something like that, are very common in the United States, and it's for the advancement of militarism, pure and simple. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. You might be might or might not be a relief to hear that we have plenty of the same here. The military and the Air Force are constantly strutting around and showing off how they can waste energy, among other things. So someone else would like to speak? I think I saw. If not, we'll move to Linda for her presentation next. Linda is with Bucky, who's also with us tonight, co-chair of the Appalachian Peace Education Center, which has been going for about the same amount of time as we have in Abingdon, UK. When she last appeared with us in one of these meetings, she told us how she's an active member of the Sierra Club, which is the world's oldest, they claim anyway, environmental organization. It's a US phenomenon, it's a thing, and I'm sure they have lots and lots of fractious debates amongst themselves, but I'm sure that Linda, as an active member and indeed a leader of APEC, will be on the right side in many of those debates within that organization. Anyway, would you like to speak, Linda, now?
Well, thank you. Yes, and mostly I'd like to tell a story. I'm coming to you from Jonesboro. Well, at least I have a fashionable Jonesboro address. And Jonesboro is the home of the International Storytelling Center. And so this, I suppose, will be an international story. When our family traveled to Barcelona a few years back, we knew we were going to the pickpocketing capital of the world. We knew that we would be up against some of the most skilled, the most crafty, the most legendary thieves on the planet. Having both grown up in New York City, my husband and I thought, we got this. Wrong. On the subway, we kept our daughter and luggage between us and kept alert. But my husband still found a hand that wasn't his in the front pocket of his pants. And I, when leaving the subway car, felt for my wallet and it was gone. I had made a plan, but failed to implement it. I was vigilant, but distracted by a fight between two nearby passengers who might very well have been members of the gang. Instead of keeping a hand on my wallet, I reached for my daughter instead to get between her and the commotion. When we got to our hotel, we were advised to report the incident to the police station. As New Yorkers, we wondered, what good would that do? But he insisted, and we met a very understanding detective who told us she had been pickpocketed 3 times. A fact that not only amused her colleagues, but also made me feel less foolish. The detective also informed us that Barcelona's pickpockets are unarmed and nonviolent. Otherwise, they wouldn't be charged with just a misdemeanor, should they ever get caught, but would instead land in jail for a very long time. The detective's parting advice was, quote, lose your manners. So in the spirit of Tolstoy, who called out warmongers and their bureaucratic and political allies and all who would take from the poor family, quote, its last cow for taxes to be spent on cannons or on the pay and pensions of idle officials who live in luxury. To Tolstoy in 1893, they were, in his words, worse than useless. To me, in 2021, the violent, heavily armed criminals of the nuclear racket are worse than pickpockets. And our presidents know it. Eisenhower knew it. During his administration, the nuclear weapons stockpile grew more than tenfold. But instead of screaming in his farewell speech, "We've been robbed," he just claimed that there was merely a potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power. Only the potential. In fact, the power of the The politely named military-industrial complex had already been demonstrated during his presidency. Control over the so-called president's weapon had already been usurped. Obama probably knew it too, but he projected false hope by the selection of Global Zero supporter Chuck Hagel as his first defense secretary and the current CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative as energy secretary. One of our friends and collaborators in the disarmament movement, Bob Alvarez, told me at the time, hold your powder regarding Ernie Moniz's selection for the Department of Energy. Even an insider like Bob, who had been a senior policy advisor at DOE, was fooled into thinking that the Obama administration could and would seize control of the nuclear racket. I was wrong again. The pickpockets in Barcelona's subway, nuclear warmongers instigate fights to divert attention from their thievery. First, the Soviets were the threat, then the Russians. The so-called threats are China and North Korea now, but especially China, which the hawks in our government want to hold accountable for the novel coronavirus. How, may I ask, is nuclear warmongering going to end this pandemic? Is the deal for Australia's new nuclear submarines going to prevent any more COVID deaths anywhere, ever? And like Barcelona pickpockets, nuclear warmongers are devious, entrenched in the economy and in our violent society. Just as city officials might claim to try to rid pickpockets from our streets, American presidents have claimed to seek a world free of nuclear weapons. They agreed in 1985 and again in 2021 that a nuclear war not be won and never be fought, but continue to plan for and threaten nuclear war. Bombs über alles. That's how Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance sums it up. It's a racket and a very lucrative one for the war profiteers, but not for the climate. From the creation of the secret city to the construction of the world's largest building, the Manhattan Project caused enormous greenhouse gas emissions. As Hilary had stated, concrete and steel making are highly energy intensive industries, and large quantities of both materials were employed in the construction of Oak Ridge and the Y-12 enrichment plant. Some historians estimate that 1.6 billion kilowatt hours of electricity were consumed to enrich the uranium for the first bomb, while others report that the Manhattan Project consumed as much as 1/7 of all the electricity produced in the United States at that time. The coal-fired steam plant used at Y-12 for just providing the heat for the buildings alone consumed an average of 51,000 tons of coal per year. Even though the old steam plant at Y-12 was recently replaced in 2010 with a gas-fired boiler, bomb making continues to threaten the climate. Likewise, the furnaces that cook the highly enriched uranium naval fuel at NFS in Irwin, Tennessee, also consume huge amounts of electricity. For most of the lives of both of these nuclear weapons facilities, the Tennessee Valley Authority would have produced the majority of the power they consumed by burning coal. Not only has nuclear warmongering directly produced greenhouse gases, the money squandered on bomb making alone, estimated at $10 trillion by former Defense Secretary Bill Perry and his co-author Tom Collina in their book called The Button, which I highly recommend, by the way, has been diverted from investments that would protect coastal cities from flooding. For example, a Bulletin of Atomic Scientists editor estimated that the elimination of just one proposed nuclear weapons system could free up enough federal funding to build a massive mechanical wall to protect New York City from sea level rise. In Warheads to Windmills, our colleague, disarmament activist Timon Wallace, demonstrated that moving the money and the scientists, the scientific talent, from the 30-year, $2 trillion nuclear weapons modernization program could pay for the Green New Deal. The Move the Money campaign estimates that for each $1 trillion spent on nuclear weapons, we could have bought 3 million home solar panel systems, or for each $1 trillion spent on nuclear weapons, we could have bought 1 million electric cars, or 1 million wind turbines, or 67 million clean biomass stoves. The opportunity cost to the climate of nuclear warmongering has been, in short, catastrophic. Ditto for nuclear power. The happy face on the bomb. From the get-go, the climate has been defrauded by the nuclear industry. As mentioned earlier, development of nuclear technology required nearly 15% of all the electricity produced in the United States in that time. So nuclear power's carbon footprint was giant-sized from the beginning. Too cheap to meter, they said. Sure, if the $2 billion spent to develop the bomb, and that was in 1945 dollars, which would be about over $30 billion in today's dollars. If those were internalized, nuclear power would have been out of reach for all but government-run utilities in centralized economies. Just as pickpockets use to distract our attention, so nuclear racketeers. When it became clear to ratepayers that nuclear was not going to be too cheap to meter, a new fraud was perpetrated. Yes, those $10 to $25 billion reactors were expensive, but they will supply reliable base load power. So they said. Reliable? Remember the 2003 heat wave in Europe, when surface water temperatures rose so high that the lack of cooling water required shutdowns of the reactors? Or the deep freeze in Texas this past winter? How did those reliable nuclear power plants work out? How many lives did those reliable nuclear reactors cost? A smothering Europe and a frozen Texas. Yet in a warming world, incompatible with a dangerous technology dependent on cool water and needing fossil fuel powered backup, crocodile tears are still flowing for the climate. Oh, they say, if only we had more reactors, we could solve the climate crisis. Or they say, oh, my poor children, what kind of future will they have if we don't invest in more nuclear to save the climate? I've seen those crocodile tears flow and heard this garbage at hearings at Oak Ridge and even at meetings at the National Academy of Sciences. One member of the self-ordained nuclear priesthood even invoked the name of Mother Teresa, I kid you not, when speaking of the need to recycle nuclear waste. The criminality of this gang knows no bounds. And that's why I'm not the only one calling them out as racketeers. So have the plaintiffs in the most fascinating lawsuit taken against these frauds ever. In September 2020, community members and whistleblowers filed a class action lawsuit in U.S. District Court in Ohio. The defendants included the company that succeeded the quasi-public U.S. Enrichment Corp, as well as a veritable who's who of weapons complex companies, including BWXT, the owner of Nuclear Fuel Services, which is 10 miles down the road from where I live. But that's not all. individually named in the suit are corporate managers, supervisors, every one of them a gangster, as well as the government officials who sanctioned or themselves participated in the conspiracy. Specifically, the suit seeks to halt a, quote, pattern of corruption and flagrant disregard for human life perpetrated by the defendants and the United States Department of Energy, end quote. Plaintiff's brief states that cancer in some affected areas are 700% greater than the national average, and that the, quote, criminal enterprise altered or destroyed the medical records of workers at the Portsmouth enrichment plant and suppressed information, and this goes to what Hilary was saying, secrecy of the military industrial complex is a universal problem. The release of transuranics, which were clandestinely introduced into the enrichment process. The community's concerns about Portsmouth erupted when Neptunium-237 was found inside the classrooms of a middle school located about 3 miles from the enrichment plant. The school was closed and the students transferred. Additional offsite sampling for the community by Dr. Michael Ketterer, a chemist and friend of Apex, has found uranium and plutonium in homes, schools, and creeks. Yet at a public meeting on May 15, 2019, DOE staff told a concerned crowd that the contaminants found in their kids' school was either from fallout or from smoke detectors. The nuclear fraud enterprise, which is what the attorneys in this case are being in court now, have operated an association in fact enterprise with the purpose of achieving pecuniary gains, just like pickpockets, but worse, because these gangsters have also threatened physical harm against the whistleblowers and their families. And if you like, I'll share to the attendees later an interview done by a colleague of mine in the Sierra Club of these whistleblowers, and they will tell you the harrowing tales that they have been, and the appalling, absolutely criminal threats against their welfare. Our friends in Ohio have lost their patience and their manners and are employing the racketeer influence and corrupt practices statute to put this racket out of business. While I'm excited about the possibility of this RICO case and the new tactic to expose corruption, I am deeply concerned that one of the defendants is a public servant. He's with the Centers for Disease Control, Division of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, the government agency charged with protecting workers. I'm not surprised though, because another division of the CDC, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, was called out years ago as being inconclusive by design. They continue to pick this industry of racketeers continues to pick the pockets of taxpayers, rob the health and safety of the workers and the nuclear neighborhoods where they operate, and defraud the climate of protective investments. So where do we go from here? To what Gorbachev and former Secretary of State George Shultz called the promised land of nuclear disarmament, and fast too, because it's 100 seconds to midnight. We in APEC are asking, demanding really, now that we know that we need to lose our manners, we are demanding a plan for disarmament from our government. Our proposed drop dead date for nuclear weapons is 2036. 50 years from the Reykjavik summit that brought us closer than the world has ever been to eliminating nuclear weapons. Our proposal will ask for interim measures like dismantling the land-based missile system and the transformation of the nuclear sponge, a barbaric idea that the Midwest of the United States would be sacrificed, a nuclear sacrifice zone, and transform it to a carbon sink. APEC has also signed on to the letter to climate envoy John Kerry, and this is very much in alignment with what Hilary was speaking of. The letter was by Veterans for Peace. Together we told John Kerry, because the Pentagon is the world's largest institutional user of fossil fuels, we cannot afford to ignore the elephant in the room or remain in denial. So we're on record for proposing, as Hilary was saying, the inclusion of the military expenditures on assault really on the climate should be accounted for. We are also supporters of and participants in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. This movement has already succeeded in getting the Biden administration and Congress to tackle childhood poverty and has support for a third reconstruction that seeks to transform our violent society. Ending the culture of war is a principal demand of the Poor People's Campaign. Success in court by the community in Ohio and potential cases in other nuclear neighborhoods, maybe like ours, I don't know, as well as the growth of the powerful Poor People's Campaign, we hope. The help of the cloud of witnesses who have gone before us, including friends and colleagues whose memory continues to inspire our work. Maybe, just maybe, the pandemic will be a portal to a world free of nuclear weapons. Good things can happen. Even governments can get good things done. A year or so after I was pickpocketed, I received a letter from the Spanish consulate returning my driver's license and health insurance card. Ha! Imagine that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was a really, really nice thing to listen to. And I loved your comparison of pickpocketing with nuclear racket, and whereby the nuclear racket is worse than pickpockets. Hard to disagree with, and I find the idea of certainly of losing our manners very appealing. Some people would say don't have too many in the first place, but there we are. Okay, any questions to Linda, and then maybe broaden it into a short general discussion? Hilary in particular, have you got any points you would like to make? Because you were mentioned once or twice. You'll need to unmute.
Well, one thing that occurred to me is, what do you think of the TPNW? Have you had much support for that in your area? The new
Well,
treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons.
oh, I believe it's wonderful. And but it has had no effect on the nuclear establishment here in America, or even though people like former Defense Secretary Bill Perry has said that the United States should join the treaty, should join the TPNW. And and recognize those 122 countries' desire to not be annihilated by our recklessness. You know, in our report to we made a presentation, Bucky and I and one of our colleagues, Ralph Hutchison from the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance. We made a presentation to our Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, and one of the things that Tim Kaine said, and this is the reason for my bringing up Bill Perry all the time, and I will do that more in our report to Senator Kaine once I get that done. Is because he said, well, what does Bill Perry say? Now, Bill Perry has always, I mean, he's not shy. He's 97 years old, and he knows he doesn't have much breath left in his body. So he's out there all the time, They know full well what Bill Perry thinks and says, but we'll repeat it anyway. Bill Perry also says that that we should be signatories to the TPNW. Look, it was a celebration. It surely was a shot in the arm for the disarmament community, and I had been keeping a chart, a table really, next to my desk and checking daily. Actually, I haven't checked in quite a few weeks to see if there are any more signatories. And so when the 50th came, it was like I'm not sure if we broke open a bottle of Prosecco, but we should have. It's yes, it's wonderful. And what I said to Senator Kaine was that we well, I was quoting Pope Francis, who said that we will be judged. And then I went on to say, but we, in a way, we've already been judged. We've been judged for our nuclear warmongering by 122 countries who agreed to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, who say you have no right. You have no right to threaten our planet. It's our planet too. Threaten our planet with devastation. So that's what I think about it. The warmongers, just like the nuclear racketeers and the Congress, they're going. As a matter of fact, talking about Sierra Club, Mike, Sierra Club is in a constant struggle to get its members and its leadership, some of its leadership, to be full-throated against nuclear. They don't nuclear power. They don't recognize the leadership of the Sierra Club. Doesn't recognize the carbon footprint of nuclear power, or it's the fact that the nuclear weapons complex needs nuclear power to persist in order to make components of nuclear weapons, because tritium is produced in nuclear power plants in the Tennessee Valley Authority, and it was said in black and white by the previous administration's nuclear posture review that we need to maintain a substantial fleet of nuclear power plants in order to provide the military with its requirements. So that's where we are with respect to the TPNW. Still makes me smile to think that it's been done, which is a good thing.
Thank you very much, Linda. Bucky, speak.
I just wanted to say, I think one of the challenges for our group and for your group is to figure out how we in the belly of the beast can be effective with the people in those 122 countries. It's, I guess, I don't want to say easier, but those people have come out firmly against nuclear weapons. And, you know, obviously none of the nuclear power governments have shown any interest or willingness to do so. And how do we use that treaty to push our government even more? I do know, Linda and I have been on some of the calls. They, a number of the anti-nuclear peace groups around the country have been meeting to try to take advantage of the treaty. I sort of feel like so far we haven't come up with the key to taking advantage of that treaty.
Thank you very much. I wonder if there are any questions, comments, challenges from the rest of the meeting. There are 23 participants left, so well, I think that's as much as we ever had, which is brilliant. So, any further observations from anybody or questions?
I have a question.
Carol, thank you.
My name's Carol, and I know Linda well. She's much more knowledgeable about all of this than I could ever be, and I appreciate that very much. I'm curious, whenever I do hear any discussion about dismantling or diminishing our nuclear stockpile, it seems that the attention here seems to be pointed at facilities or locations that are possibly at risk of being taken over elsewhere, that aren't being managed elsewhere. It seems to me that there's very little serious discussion about diminishing or dismantling active sites within the US. Am I correct in that, Linda?
Yes, yes. The Obama administration has been applauded for tightening up the loose nukes and helping to reduce those types of threats. But in 2012 and in 2020, 2020 it was, senior citizens, some of whom we have met, walked right into the Y-12 nuclear weapons facility, you know, doing a plowshares action, and into the Trident submarine base in Georgia. They, in both cases, it wasn't until they flagged down security, especially at Y-12. It wasn't until they, Sister Megan and Michael and Greg, said, we're here. And that security guard was an understanding fellow. He had worked at other sites where plowshares actions had occurred, recognized what was going on right away. They were in the shoot to kill zone. He did none of that. He you know, handcuffed them and then called for backup. You know, of course they were nonviolent. It was a nonviolent protest. But it was a demonstration of the lack of security. None of the cameras in the periphery of the plant. By the way, the company who was responsible for security at the Fort Knox of uranium, which is what it's called, known as. Maybe it's no longer known that as the Fort Knox of uranium. But anyway, none of the cameras on the periphery caught them. There weren't alarms on the fences that they cut. Really, I mean, really, you know, that we are secure from that these facilities. And by the way, the one that's down the road from where I live, it's on a much smaller reservation. Someone with the throwing arm of a football quarterback in the United States. That's a different kind of football than you guys play. But anyway, with a throwing could easily pitch a weapon into the nuclear fuel services facility from the road. Easy. You know, so that these weapons enhance our security is clearly a fallacy, and then we've got the problem of so-called rogue nations. But I will include, and I really do thank you for asking me to speak, because it got me out of sick leave, so to speak, and also can help me gel my thoughts a little better with respect to speaking to or addressing this issue with Senator Kaine, because we can't trust our military with drones. This past week, and the murder of children and other civilians in Afghanistan with a retaliatory drone strike. How can we trust them how can we trust them with nuclear weapons, which have the potential to destroy the planet and the climate? There's the other, the other issue of the climate driving us into a nuclear winter and into mass starvation on the planet. So so anyway, that's where I am. I appreciate your
we're very glad.
I hope
we're very glad that you did join us, because it's been really entirely absorbing to listen to you. Any other points or contributions? Brickbat, whatever.
I would just add that I hope that those of you across the pond can sleep well tonight, knowing the sad circumstances of our stockpile, of our horrendous stockpile. So anyway.
Well, I mean, you could say that the UK is a rogue state in its own right, where we've announced an increased nuclear arsenal to be developed. It's clearly in flagrant breach of the nuclear non-proliferation, which we're signatories to. We're not in any sense, and never have in any sense, made serious attempts to do our side of the bargain. That's of course not just true of the UK, but we're in it up to our necks with the US. We're too well. I think I first read it from Noam Chomsky, but he called the UK America's attack dog, a phrase which is heard more often now. That was about 20 years ago. I read that. Anyway,
Mike, do any of you have an opinion on this new deal with Australia that has so for those this nuclear submarine fleet that we in the United States have apparently agreed to work with Britain on this, to much to the chagrin of France.
That's right. I mean, I'll give my quick opinion, which is very only addresses part of it. I don't trust any of the nuclear establishments or war-making establishments, whether in France or the US or Australia or Britain. I think the South China Sea is laden with threats to China and has been for a very long time, but you'd never know that from the main media. It stinks. I don't know quite what the full motivations are, but I personally actually want to read a bit more about it and think about it a bit more. But there we are. That's my. What do other people have to say about the Australia, UK? I imagine that the UK won't get much of a look in when it comes to the factory contracts. You know, they'll be there officially, but I imagine the US manufacturers will muscle in probably more than the Brits. Serve them right. I mean, the Brits, right? Anybody else? I mean, that's a very partial view. I mean, it's very my off the top reaction really, which needs to develop somewhat. Anybody else want to answer Linda's question? Sally, unmute.
Yeah, I mean, my reaction hearing about the nuclear subs in Australia is just that it's a step in the wrong direction. You know, it's spending more on, and it's ramping up the danger of conflict with China at a time when we should be spreading peace with these other countries. That's all. It's just more of the same, isn't it?
Thank you. Well, I guess, oh, Carol, you're just waving goodbye. Thank you. It's been I've enjoyed this session immensely. It's great. Thank you. And I just love internationalism when I see it, and I've seen it tonight, which is great. And it's not just the UK and the USA. One of our speakers, I imagine, was talking from Ireland. Which side of the Irish border, I don't know. But anyway, so it was a three-nation chat. So thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you for everything, really, just being there. And I stand with the Kings Bay ploughshares. You must maybe tell us something about that. I'll make a note to look it up anyway. Kings Bay ploughshares. Okay, well, shall we close the meeting there? Yep. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much.
Take care.
Indeed. Indeed.
Thank you for hosting.
Our pleasure.
Really.
Our pleasure.